asked us the question, what moment in Jesus' life would you choose, if you could choose any, would you want to be there on? Eric chose the whole Luke chapter 9 portion because it's meant so much to us, but it's so different than it's so different than how we do training most of the time now. But let me back up. God rewards all growth with pruning. If you grow, you will be pruned. If you don't grow, you're not alive. It's a normal thing in the kingdom, but he honors growth with pruning. All pruning is for the purpose of increase. God is so focused on increase. He's not anti-pleasure. He's the God of pleasure. He's not anti-blessing. He's the God of blessing. But all of that is unto something. It is unto growth, maturity, and development. And the way Jesus worked with and trained his disciples is so unusual. Because he empowered people long before they deserved it, long before they earned it. And he empowered them to such a measure that they would actually make messes out of their success. When you get to Luke chapter 9, what you see is you actually have 12 disciples that are sent out. They're given power and authority. And they're sent to their hometowns. They go out 2 by 2. And they go and they preach the gospel. And as they go to their towns, they see the same miracles happen through them that were happening through Jesus. You can imagine if you're one of 2 that go to a certain city and you see the exact things happen through you that were happening through Jesus, when you regroup with the other guys, you're not assuming they had the same experience. You are thinking you are the chosen. You are thinking you are the anointed individual because it's obvious and nobody else could have had quite the same measure of breakthrough that you experienced. Jesus had this effect on people that was so profound that so many things that are amazing to me. One is that Jesus could correct you and you felt happy about it. People liked to be with him and he would address their stuff and they didn't run away. You know, the only people that ran away were the Pharisees who didn't want anything to do with change, but everyone else was attracted to this one. And they were attracted by the multiplying of food, the healing of the sick, but he would get in their face and talk to them about stuff, and they were just grateful to be there. And so you have this environment that people were glad to be there, regardless of what Jesus dealt with, number one. But number two, he somehow carried this atmosphere around him where everybody that got near to him began to dream. Now, it'd be difficult for any of you to convince me that when Peter was growing up, that he dreamt of being a world changer. He was groomed to be a fisherman. All of these guys were groomed for that kind of station or role in life. They weren't thinking in terms of impacting nations. But just a little while with Jesus, they start talking. You know, John's mom comes, hey, I've got a favor to ask. When you come into your kingdom, they're not thinking about world domination. They're actually thinking and planning about this is working. And we now see how this is going to work. And could my son sit on your right hand and your left? And so they're thinking, they're dreaming about this role. Now, what Jesus was so amazing at is he would let them dream about greatness, and then he would prune what grew, because if it kept growing, it would be so unhealthy, it would work against the very thing he was building in them. And so he would prune their concept of greatness back to a desired size, if you will. He would adjust, he would trim them. And what he never did was slap them around for dreaming to be great. Instead, what he would do is he would redefine greatness, which is really interesting. He would, instead of saying, you are nothing, you have no right to dream of anything, you're just lucky I came along to save you. You'd be in hell right now if I weren't here. He didn't do any of that. Instead, he'd let them dream, and they would argue as to who was the greatest. And he would let them dream. I'm greater than you. No, I'm greater than you. Jesus shows up. What are you talking about? Nothing. And he had this way with them to let them completely manifest who they were. And he would always preserve the part that was used for the kingdom, and he would cut off the part that was dangerous. Does that illustration work for you? He would prune, because what he wanted to do was preserve the integrity of a God-given desire for significance. He wanted to prune the plant back to that, to preserve the God-given desire for significance, but prune back that self-serving part, because that would destroy the very thing that God was building. Does any of that make sense to you? All right, let's get into the chapter. For me, this is one of the recreational chapters of the Bible. I just love it so much. Verse 46 of Luke chapter 9. Then a dispute arose among them as to which of them would be the greatest. Jesus, perceiving the thought of their heart, took a little child and set him by him. And he said to them, whoever receives this little child in my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives him who sent me. He who is least among you is the one who is great. This is fascinating. So they're thinking of significance as being big. And Jesus says, you see this child? This is great. This is greatness. So what did he do? He didn't rebuke the passion for significance. He instead pruned it to where it would grow in a way that was impacting according to God's design. So the next story fits right into this one. And it says in verse 49, John answered and said, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he doesn't follow with us. Jesus said, do not forbid him. He who is not against us is on our side. So here's what's interesting. They're arguing as to who's the greatest. Jesus adjusts the concept of greatness, not the hunger for greatness, so that they would grow into something that was kingdom and not something that would undermine. Then it's like they said, John says, all right, so I know we're not greater than one another, but we are certainly greater than them. Them are the people trying to cast out demons, and they're not in our crowd. They're not in our club. So now he's got this greatness. Our group is greater than their group. And it's this whole thing of competition once again. And what does Jesus do? He gives them a most unusual answer. He said, if they're not against us, they're for us. We've heard if they're not for us, they're against us. But Jesus turns it around. And he says, if they're not against us, they're actually for us. What would happen if we just approach people in our communities with that one simple concept? Just believing they were actually for us because they haven't taken a stand against us. So here Jesus hears of these people that are casting out demons in his name. And the disciples want to control who's doing what. And so they trim it back. But Jesus is the empowering one who hears of others that are using his name to cast out demons. And he approves. John wants to control it. Jesus wants to empower. And so he changes their perspective. What is he doing? He sees a branch growing that could become dangerous in time. And so he trims it back to, I want to preserve your loyalty to the team. I want to protect the value that you have for protecting what we're doing as a group. And I'm going to prune this branch back this far because I want the fruit that grows from this to be something that truly brings honor to God. And so he prunes back their concept of competition, of what team, what group, what denomination is better than another. And so the Lord just trims and prunes that concept back for them. And then we come to the last story, which really is the most funny. And again, Eric made reference to this morning. He said in verse 51, it came to pass when the time had come for him to be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers before his face. And as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare for him. But they, being the city, did not receive him, because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. When his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, just as Elijah did? I love this story so much. I love it so much. Probably for mischievous reasons, but I love this story so much. Just imagine with me. They've come back from being sent out 2 by 2 to minister in their hometowns. What must they have seen happen to make them think it was possible, with Jesus giving a nod of approval, to call down fire and consume an entire city for the glory of God? I love the fact that in my translation, it adds this one phrase: would you like for us to call down fire as Elijah did? Because if you're going to sin, you need to have a biblical reason. You need to find an excuse somewhere, and James and John had nailed it. That's what Elijah did. Imagine this. I go home after this trip. I come home. One of my staff members comes and says, Phil, we were doing an outreach in a city south of us, about an hour away, and the city fathers met us at the boundary of the city, and they said, we don't want Bethel. We don't want you guys here. We've heard about you. We don't want anything to do with you. Leave our town. And then that staff member says, so what we've done is we've set bombs around the perimeter of that city. And with your approval, we'll just set up and just blow up the entire place. And within minutes, everybody will be dead. To the glory of God, of course. In Jesus' name. Now, if that were to happen, how many of you know I would probably want to have a little conversation with that staff member? They're not quite picking up our values yet. Secondly, I probably would not have them go on the next outreach. I probably would have them sit at home, or I'd put them under someone else. Don't let them out of your sight. Don't give them a microphone. A lot of those kinds of things. I would put them on restriction. But Jesus just did it differently. He just did it differently. Look at this story. They wanted to call down fire from heaven as Elijah did. And Jesus, verse 55, he turned and he rebuked them. He said, you do not know what manner of spirit you are. In other words, you're going to have to go to a different anointing if you want to carry out this plan. This is not consistent with the Spirit of God. That's interesting, because what is consistent with the Spirit of God today is not the same as what was consistent under Elijah. And that has to be okay. Many ministries make the mistake of using Old Testament patterns for ministry instead of learning from their history, actually emulating the patterns and the values that Jesus himself did not practice. Why couldn't David build the temple? Huh? He had blood on his hands. He's a man of bloodshed. All right? Who made him a man of bloodshed? He was actually a warrior designed by God to bring Israel into the fullness of their inheritance. They never got there under Moses, for sure. He didn't get in. Joshua, all the ones who followed, they